The clink of fine crystal echoed through the silent, dimly lit restaurant, where Antonio Carlo, the notorious godfather of the Italian Mafia, sat alone, swirling the red wine in his glass. His sharp grey suit gleamed under the soft chandelier light as his mind weighed the decision he'd made. One last blind date. He didn't expect this woman to be any different from the rest. He was accustomed to controlling his world, but when Mitchell Tiana entered the room, everything shifted. The instant she walked in, the world seemed to stop. She was striking, tall, poised, with an air of confidence that immediately drew his attention. Her white dress clung to her form perfectly, contrasting sharply with the cold sophistication of the man at the table. But it was the look in her eyes, intelligent, unbothered by his presence, that both intrigued and unsettled him. She wasn't the type of woman who would cower in the face of power. Instead, she looked at him with curiosity, challenge, and something that felt like she was studying him. Antonio didn't even need to know her name yet. She had already taken his control away with a single glance. As she approached the table, he set his glass down, and for the first time in years he felt himself wondering, what exactly was she about to bring into his life? Antonio Carlo sat in his private study, the weight of the evening pressing against his chest like an old, familiar coat. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a desk lamp that illuminated the papers sprawled before him. Notes, contracts, men's lives weighed and measured. As the godfather of the Carlo Empire, his life had become a careful balancing act of power, violence, and control. The phone buzzed once more on the corner of his desk, an interruption he didn't welcome. He glanced at the screen. A reminder from his associate, Marco. Blind date. Saturday night, 7 p.m., Romano's. He cursed under his breath. He'd never been one for distractions, least of all, women. Women were complications. They came with demands, expectations, and weakness, none of which fit into the world he'd carefully constructed. But Marco was insistent. It had been a year since his last attempt at a relationship, one that had ended in bloodshed and betrayal. The thought of starting another one, let alone entertaining it, seemed absurd. Yet, he knew Marco, and Marco's reminders meant business. The kind of business Antonio preferred to avoid, but never dared to ignore. With a sigh, Antonio set down the pen he'd been toying with and stood up. His hand brushed against the window, feeling the cool night air from the city outside. His empire was built on ruthless precision, but this date, this single dinner, wasn't a transaction he could control with the same deftness. He wasn't used to being out of control, and that realization lingered in his thoughts as he adjusted his suit. A sharp gray ensemble that always spoke louder than words. A suit that demanded respect. The car ride to the restaurant was uneventful. The streets of the city slipped by unnoticed as Antonio's mind drifted, pondering the nature of the evening ahead. His reputation preceded him, and the women he'd encountered in his life had always seen him as a means to an end. Money, power, and sometimes something to fear. But there was a difference about this one. Mitchell Tiana, he was told. A black woman. Bold, beautiful, and utterly unknown to him. Her presence, in Marco's words, would be refreshing. He scoffed at the thought. Refreshing? What did that even mean in his world? Arriving at Romano's, a high-end restaurant that had long been a neutral ground for meetings both formal and dangerous, Antonio stepped out of the car. His driver handed him the door, and with it, a familiar feeling, the calm before the storm. He adjusted his cuffs, gave one last look at the city behind him, and made his way inside. The maitre d' led him through the restaurant, the soft murmurs of conversations fading into the background as he made his way toward the reserved table. He knew the moment he entered the room, the air shifted. Something was different. He took his seat, his back straight, his gaze sharp, and then she entered. Mitchell Tiana. She walked into the room like a storm, her presence undeniable. a white dress that hugged her frame perfectly, striking dark eyes that met his with an unsettling intensity. Antonio's breath hitched for the briefest of moments before he regained his composure. She was unlike anyone he'd encountered before. There was a quiet strength in the way she moved, a confidence that intrigued him. As she walked towards him, the tension between them was immediate. Antonio had no idea that this blind date would be the first step into a world he could neither control nor predict. He was a man who had lived for years in a world of power and fear, but Mitchell Tiana, standing before him now, would be the catalyst for something that would unravel his empire in ways he never saw coming. Antonio watched her approach, each step confident and deliberate, her eyes locked onto his like she could see right through him. As she drew closer, the air in the room thickened, the usual hum of the restaurant fading into the background. He straightened in his seat, fingers lightly tapping the rim of his wine glass, trying to mask the sudden unease creeping up his spine. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met. Mitchell Tiana. Her name had been spoken to him with such casual indifference by Marco, as if she were just another name on a list of many, another woman to pass through his life like so many others. But this woman, this moment, was different. She stopped a few feet from the table, and for a brief, electric second, neither of them spoke. She didn't wait for him to stand. Instead, she simply slid into the chair opposite him, the movement smooth and effortless. He could smell her perfume, a rich, sweet scent that lingered in the air long after she settled. "Antonio," she said, her voice low, steady and warm, as if she were measuring every word before it left her lips. "Mitchell," he responded, the way her name rolled off his tongue, tasting unfamiliar, foreign even. He couldn't help but notice the way her eyes flicked to his face, taking in the tattoos etched on his hands, the hardened lines around his mouth, the dark weight of his presence that commanded the room even when he said nothing. She wasn't intimidated, that much was obvious, and it intrigued him in a way he wasn't prepared for. A soft chuckle escaped her lips, breaking the silence. "I didn't expect to meet the legendary godfather of the Carlo family like this." Her words were a gentle tease, but they stung all the same. He didn't want to be known for his empire, for the violence, for the power he'd built over the years, not now, not with her sitting across from him, so effortlessly commanding his attention. "I didn't expect to be here," Antonio said, his voice low, guarded. She smiled, the corner of her mouth turning up ever so slightly. "I'm sure you didn't, but here we are." The tension between them hung like a thick fog, thickening with each glance, each unspoken word. She didn't break eye contact as she took a sip from her wine glass, and Antonio found himself following the movement of her lips, the way the red liquid swirled in the glass. He knew better than to be distracted. "What do you do, Mitchell?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "I write," she answered, her eyes never leaving his. "Stories about the people who live in the shadows, the ones who get overlooked." Antonio's brow furrowed. "The shadows, huh?" She nodded, leaning in just a fraction. "Everyone's life is a story, Antonio. Even yours. Especially yours." He couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. Mitchell Tiana wasn't like the women he usually encountered. She wasn't trying to play some game or win his approval. She was holding her ground, and that made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. Vulnerability. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was no longer in control, and he wasn't sure if he liked it. Antonio sat back in his chair, swirling the remnants of his wine in the glass, watching the liquid catch the light. His eyes were distant, unfocused, as his mind drifted far from the dimly lit restaurant. The clinking of silverware and hushed conversations around him seemed to fade into nothingness as he replayed the evening in his head. Mitchell Tiana. Her name lingered in his thoughts like an unresolved melody, a haunting note he couldn't shake. She was different, that was clear. From the moment she'd walked into the restaurant, her presence had unsettled him in ways he didn't understand. He had known women in his life, beautiful, intelligent, capable. Women who could navigate his world, women who could play the roles they were meant to play. They understood his empire, his rules. They knew how to bend, how to submit to his dominance, how to keep their distance. But Mitchell? She was a different kind of woman. A woman who didn't bend. A woman who didn't flinch in the face of his power. The way she had looked at him, so direct, so unafraid, it was as though she saw through the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself. Walls of steel, power, and control. For the first time in years, Antonio felt exposed, and he hated it. He hated how she made him feel vulnerable, like a man who wasn't in full control of everything around him. He set the glass down with a sharp clink, eyes narrowing as he stared at his reflection in the window, the same reflection he had seen for years, cold, calculating, ruthless. The Godfather, the head of the Carlo Empire. A man who could crush anyone beneath his heel, who had built an empire from the ground up, using fear, loyalty, and respect as his tools. And yet, here he was, sitting at a table, contemplating vulnerability. He had never let anyone close, never let anyone see the cracks in his armor. His heart had been sealed off, buried deep beneath years of betrayal, loss, and bloodshed. Love was a liability, a weakness. That's what he'd always believed. And yet, Mitchell's words, her presence, challenged that belief in a way he wasn't prepared for. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't looking for his wealth or his influence. She wasn't impressed by his power. Instead, she seemed to see him as a person, a complex man, full of contradictions. And for some reason, that rattled him. No one had ever dared to look at him that way. It made him feel exposed in a way he wasn't accustomed to. What did she want? What was it about her that made him question everything he knew about himself, about the life he had built? He thought back to the look in her eyes when she had spoken to him, unwavering, confident, like she wasn't afraid of him or the empire he controlled. It was as though she wasn't concerned with the power he wielded or the shadows he moved through. She wanted something else, something real. And Antonio was beginning to wonder if that was something he might want too. But no, he couldn't allow it. He couldn't let himself be distracted. His empire was too important, too fragile. Mitchell Tiana was just a woman, a fleeting moment in a world that didn't have room for softness. She was a distraction, a beautiful, infuriating distraction. And yet, for the first time in years, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly what he needed. Over the next few weeks, Mitchell found herself caught in the orbit of Antonio Carlo's world in ways she hadn't anticipated. What started as a blind date, an evening to placate a friend's persistent nudging, quickly turned into something much more complex. Antonio was like a shadow, always there, always in control, but never pushing too hard. His world, however, was a different story. It was chaotic, dangerous, and always lurking beneath the surface of their interactions. She could feel it, the tension that clung to every encounter, the threat of something violent just waiting to break through. They met again and again, each time in different settings. High-end restaurants, private corners of hidden clubs, his penthouse that overlooked the city like some fortress of solitude. She was drawn to him, that much was clear. There was a magnetism to his presence that no amount of distance or deflection could erase. But the deeper they went, the more she saw the cracks in his armor, the fragility beneath his cold exterior. She had been raised in the streets, where survival meant knowing when to stay quiet, when to fight, and when to walk away. But Antonio didn't walk away. He fought, and sometimes she wasn't sure what he was fighting for. She could see it in his eyes, a man who had buried so much of himself under layers of power, anger, and betrayal that the thought of letting anyone get close felt almost impossible. And yet, there she was, inching her way under the surface. Their time together wasn't filled with grand declarations or constant affection. It was subtle, silent moments that spoke louder than any words could. The way Antonio looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, the way his hand brushed hers just a little too long when they passed each other in a hallway. But it was also in the quiet tension that grew between them, the unsaid words, the unspoken rules. One evening, after a late dinner at a restaurant that catered to the city's elite, they stood by the windows of his penthouse, looking out over the twinkling lights of the city below. The conversation had been light, casual, but Mitchell could feel the undercurrent of something much heavier, something Antonio was trying to hold back. "You never talk about your past," Mitchell said, her voice barely above a whisper as she studied him. "I know you have one. Everyone does." Antonio didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window, his jaw clenched, the lines on his face deepening in the silence between them. Finally, he spoke, but it wasn't an answer, it was a question. "You ever wonder what it would be like to forget all of it?" His voice was low, almost regretful. "To just let it all go." Mitchell was quiet, considering his words. She had her own past, filled with pain, with mistakes, with people who had betrayed her. But she hadn't built an empire from the ashes of that pain. She hadn't lived the way he had, where every decision was a matter of life and death. "I think we both know you can't just walk away from a life like that," she said softly. "And neither can I." His gaze shifted to hers then, and for a moment she saw something vulnerable in his eyes, something he didn't show often, if ever. It was the kind of vulnerability that made her question what she was really getting into. The deeper she was drawn into his world, the more she realized it wasn't just about him. It was about everything that came with him. The violence, the danger, the constant push and pull between wanting to protect him and wanting to protect herself. As the days passed, Mitchell found herself tangled in the web of his world, unable to pull away. But the question loomed over her. How much of this world could she handle? How much of Antonio could she truly embrace without losing herself in the process? Mitchell had always known danger was part of the world she'd stepped into with Antonio. She'd felt it in the air the moment she'd first looked into his eyes, sharp, calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. But she hadn't realized how close the danger was, how quickly it could close in on her, until one late evening when it came crashing into her life like a thunderstorm. It started small, strange calls, men in dark suits lurking outside her apartment, watching her every move. At first, she'd brushed it off as coincidence, but the unease grew, the tension palpable, like the air before a storm. Antonio hadn't said much about the men who worked for him, the people who moved in and out of his empire, but she had begun to see the signs. The way his eyes narrowed when he spoke about business, the way he held himself, always on guard, as though there was an invisible threat constantly hanging over him, and now it was aimed at her. She sat at the kitchen table, going over notes for her latest piece on the city's hidden communities when her phone buzzed, the number unfamiliar. She hesitated but answered anyway. "Mitchell Tiana," a low voice rasped on the other end. "You don't know me, but I know you. We know where you live, what you do, who you're with. We want to talk to you. And if you don't come to us, we'll make sure your little friends pay the price." The words hit her like a slap. Her heart raced, pulse pounding in her ears as the phone dropped from her hand. She wasn't scared. No, she was furious. They didn't know her. They didn't know who they were dealing with. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly as she grabbed her jacket, making a quick decision. She wasn't going to cower. She wasn't going to let them drag her into some game of threats and intimidation. She had already learned from the streets. Survival meant keeping your head on straight, never showing fear, and standing your ground. The meeting point was a run-down warehouse on the edge of the city, the kind of place where people disappeared without a trace. She wasn't foolish enough to think it was a coincidence that the call had come just after Antonio had been distracted with his business dealings. She knew exactly who was behind this. Rivals, men who wanted to shake the foundation of Antonio's empire, men who thought she could be used to get to him. As she walked toward the warehouse, the cold wind biting at her skin, Mitchell felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She wasn't just a woman caught up in a criminal world she barely understood anymore. She was a target, and she would not go down quietly, She had fought for everything she had, her independence, her career, her place in this world. No one, not even Antonio's enemies, would take that from her. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and menacing. She stepped inside, her breath shallow, but her resolve hardening with every step. There were men inside, at least 3 of them, lurking in the shadows. She didn't flinch. Instead, she walked straight toward them, her heels clicking against the concrete floor with each step, her back straight and her eyes locked on the leader. "You made a mistake thinking I would be afraid," she said, her voice calm, unyielding. "I'm not here to negotiate. You want something from Antonio. You go through him." The men exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her confidence. But Mitchell wasn't backing down. This was her life. And she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all people who operated in the dark, scare her into submission. One of the men stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "You don't get it, do you? You're nothing more than leverage." "Not anymore," she shot back, her eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. "I'm not your pawn. I'm done playing games." The tension in the room was thick, but Mitchell stood her ground, ready for whatever came next. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the man she cared about, for the life she wanted to build, even if it meant facing down the demons of his world head-on. Antonio stared out the window of his penthouse, the skyline of the city sprawling below him like a kingdom he'd built, brick by brick. The weight of it all pressed down on him, the empire he had fought for, the power he wielded, the loyalty he demanded. Yet tonight, his mind wasn't on contracts or rival families. His thoughts were consumed by one thing: Mitchell. The events of the past few days had changed everything. She wasn't just some fleeting distraction anymore. Mitchell had slipped under his skin in a way he hadn't expected, making him question the very foundation of his world. And now, it seemed his enemies were testing that foundation, pushing him to a breaking point. He had known this would happen, of course. He had known that the moment he allowed her into his life, the consequences would be severe. The danger would find its way to her, just as it always did to anyone close to him, but he hadn't anticipated how much it would hurt to see her caught in the crossfire of his empire. To see the way she held herself, still strong, but clearly worn by the weight of the world he had pulled her into. His phone buzzed on the table in front of him. The name flashing on the screen sent a chill through his veins. Marco. "I've been hearing things." Marco's voice crackled through the phone. "Rumors of a move, a big one. Someone's making their move on you. The rivals. Yakuza, they're stepping up. They're coming for us, for you. They know about Mitchell." Antonio's hand tightened around the phone. The Yakuza had always been a thorn in his side, but now they were coming for Mitchell? He couldn't let that happen, not after everything she had already endured. "Where?" Antonio's voice was low, controlled. "There's a meeting tomorrow night. They want to negotiate. I'd call it a trap, but we need to hear them out," Marco continued. "This could be a way to end this, but it could also be the beginning of something worse." Antonio's jaw clenched. Negotiation wasn't something he was accustomed to. He didn't make deals unless they were on his terms, and he always had a plan. But Mitchell, she was different. His mind flashed to the moment when she'd stood up to his enemies, unafraid, determined. He'd never been more impressed by someone, and yet here he was, torn between his empire and the woman who had somehow become the center of his world. "I'll be there," Antonio said, hanging up without another word. He walked toward the glass doors that led to the balcony, the cool night air brushing against his face as he stepped outside. The city lights twinkled like distant stars, but tonight they felt distant, cold. For the first time in years, Antonio didn't feel the same pull of power that had always guided him. He felt torn between the life he had built, the empire that had cost him so much, and the woman who had walked into his life and made him want something else, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. Mitchell had given him a glimpse of what it might mean to live outside the cage he had constructed for himself. But the empire he had spent years building wasn't something he could walk away from. His family, his legacy, his men, they depended on him. But as the thought of Mitchell's face crossed his mind, the soft strength in her gaze, the way she had stood up to him, something inside of him shifted. He wasn't just fighting for the empire anymore. He was fighting for her, for them, and that meant risking everything. The weight of his decision felt heavier than any fight he had ever faced. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever choice he made, it would change everything. And the question that haunted him was simple. Could he have both, Mitchell and his empire, or would one have to fall? The warehouse was silent, the only sound the distant hum of the city outside, muffled by the thick walls and steel beams. Antonio stood at the entrance, the shadows of his men flanking him, their expressions hard as stone. He had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, his chest tightened with the weight of the choice he had to make. His empire, the life he had built from the ground up, was on the line, but so was Mitchell. He could feel her presence in his mind, even though she wasn't here. The way she had looked at him, unwavering, when he had told her about his world, the world of loyalty, of betrayal, of power. She hadn't run. She hadn't blinked. And now, as the men around him readied for the confrontation, Antonio couldn't shake the image of her face, her smile, her strength. She had become more than a distraction. She had become something he wasn't ready to lose. The Yakuza were waiting inside, their silhouettes visible through the narrow windows of the warehouse. They had made their move, and now Antonio would have to decide if he was willing to risk everything, his empire, his position, his control, for a woman who had no place in this world, a woman who had already gotten caught in the chaos he had created. He took a step forward, his men following suit. The air was thick with tension, each footstep a silent countdown to the inevitable. The moment his rivals had been waiting for. He had always been the one to call the shots, to dictate the terms, but tonight he wasn't sure he could keep everything in his grasp. Inside, the leader of the Yakuza, a man named Ryota, stood waiting, his arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Antonio didn't waste time with pleasantries. He didn't need to. "Ryota," Antonio's voice was steady, ice cold. "Let's get to it." Ryota's eyes flicked to Antonio's men, then to Antonio himself. "You're a stubborn man, Carlo. You should have handed over what we wanted weeks ago. Now, you'll pay the price." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Antonio didn't react. He had heard these words before. Rivals and enemies always thought they could break him, always thought they could take him down. But they didn't know him like he knew himself. They didn't know how far he would go to protect what was his. And Mitchell, she was now his. "You came to me, Ryota," Antonio said, his voice low, dangerous. "You think I haven't seen this play before? You think I'll just hand over what's mine?" He took a step closer, his presence suffocating, the room shrinking around them. Mitchell's face flashed in his mind again. The moment she had challenged him, stood her ground, refused to back down. He knew then she wasn't just part of his life. She was the part he had been missing all along. Ryota's smirk faltered as he realized Antonio wasn't intimidated. "You'll regret this, Carlo." Antonio's jaw clenched, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He wasn't just defending an empire anymore. He was defending something far more precious. Mitchell had become the one thing that made all of this empire, this life, feel worth it. He wasn't going to let it slip away. "I'm done negotiating," Antonio said, his eyes darkening. "You want war? You've got it." In the ensuing chaos, gunfire rang out, but Antonio didn't flinch. He moved through the warehouse like a man possessed, the gunfire a blur as his men took down Ryota's men, one by one. But through the violence, Antonio's focus remained on one thing: Mitchell. He couldn't lose her. Not after everything she had shown him, everything they had shared. As the dust settled and Ryota's men lay defeated, Antonio stood in the center of the room, blood and sweat staining his suit. His empire was still standing, but something had changed. Mitchell had changed him, and now there was no going back. He didn't need the empire anymore. He needed her. "Get the car ready," Antonio said, his voice hoarse but resolute. He had a woman to protect. And everything else, his power, his control, no longer mattered. The silence in Antonio's penthouse was deafening. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the hollow, uneasy silence that follows a storm. The dust from the night's chaos had settled, but the tension remained, thick in the air between Antonio and Mitchell. She sat across from him, her eyes unreadable, her posture stiff as if she were still bracing herself for the next blow. Antonio, on the other hand, leaned against the sleek marble counter, trying to steady the storm of emotions crashing through him, the gunfight, the violence, the lives lost. He had been through it all before. It had never fazed him. He had always moved through these moments like a machine, unaffected, calculating. But tonight, it was different. Mitchell had been in the middle of it. She had seen the carnage. And worse, she had been caught in it, dragged into his world of bloodshed and power. He couldn't shake the image of her in that warehouse, standing tall and unafraid, but he could see the fear behind her eyes now. She had seen the side of him that no one was supposed to see. The side of him that wasn't the Godfather, the leader, the man who controlled everything. She had seen his weakness, and in a way, he had seen hers. She wasn't just some innocent bystander. She was in this now. She was part of his world, whether he liked it or not. He had spent so many years keeping people at arm's length, guarding himself against the possibility of feeling something more than duty. But now, with Mitchell, he wasn't sure he could keep pretending that he was the same man he had been before. She had already unraveled parts of him that no one else had even come close to touching. Mitchell looked at him then, her eyes piercing through him like she was trying to figure him out. He had always prided himself on being unreadable, but she was different. She wasn't intimidated by his silence, by his brooding. She wasn't afraid to ask the questions that no one else dared to. "You should have let me go," she said quietly, her voice steady but strained. "You shouldn't have pulled me into this, Antonio. This life, it's not mine. I don't belong here." Antonio felt a pang of guilt cut through him. It wasn't the first time she had said something like this, but it hit differently now. He had never meant for her to be caught in the crossfire of his world. He had never wanted her to be a casualty of the empire he had spent his life building. "I never asked you to be part of this," Antonio said, his voice low, raw with emotion. "But I can't keep you at arm's length anymore, Mitchell. You're in this whether I want you to be or not, and damn it, I need you." Her eyes softened, the walls she had built around herself starting to crack. For a moment, she looked vulnerable, human, just like him. The vulnerability in her gaze hit him harder than any bullet ever could. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she replied, her voice thick with uncertainty. "This life, the danger, the secrets, it's too much. I've spent my whole life fighting for a way out, Antonio. I'm not sure I can keep living in a world like this." Antonio stepped toward her then, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been good with words, never been good at expressing what he felt, but with Mitchell, it was different. He reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let him, her eyes closing as if letting herself feel the weight of the moment. "I won't ask you to stay. Not if you don't want this," Antonio said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I can't let you go, Mitchell. Not now. Not after everything." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. For the first time, Antonio didn't see the distant, guarded woman he had come to know. He saw someone who was just as torn as he was, someone who had the courage to face the mess they had both made. "I'm not leaving you," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of the decision. "But I can't keep pretending this is just a game, Antonio. You need to decide. Your empire or me?" Antonio didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he needed one. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the penthouse as Antonio sat by the window, staring out at the sprawling city below. For the first time in a long time, the weight of his empire didn't feel so heavy. The usual hunger for control, the need to dominate, it all seemed distant, almost irrelevant now. He had built this life with blood and sweat, sacrificed everything to make it what it was. But today, something had changed. Mitchell stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft light. Her presence was a calm, steadying force, just like she had been since the moment she had entered his life. She had shown him that it wasn't all about power and control, that there was more to life than the empire he had spent his years constructing. There was love, there was trust, and there was a future, one that neither of them could ignore anymore. She crossed the room slowly, her gaze never leaving him. As she reached him, she didn't say anything. She just sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was full of understanding, of things they didn't need to say out loud. The weight of the decision they had both made hung in the air. And yet, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom. "I've been thinking," Antonio said, his voice low but steady. "We've both spent too much of our lives fighting against things, fighting against the world we're in, fighting against what we want, but maybe it's time we start fighting for something instead." Mitchell turned to look at him, her eyes soft, but there was something fierce in them too, something that made him believe she was ready for whatever came next. She had never been afraid to challenge him, to question his world, but now she was standing by him. She wasn't just part of his life. She was becoming a part of his world. "We can't change what's already been done," she replied, her voice gentle but filled with determination. "But we can build something new, together. If we're going to do this, Antonio, it can't be just about the power. It has to be about trust, about building something real." Antonio looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the woman who had changed everything for him. She wasn't just the one person who had managed to break through his walls. She was the one person who had shown him a new way to live, to lead, to love. And he wasn't going to lose that. "I've spent too long thinking I could control everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the one thing I can't control is you. And I don't want to anymore." Mitchell smiled, a small, knowing smile. She reached over, taking his hand in hers, squeezing it firmly. "Then let's do this together. We'll take the empire you've built, the power you've worked for, and make it something different, something that works for both of us. But I'm not living in the shadows. I won't be just a part of your world, Antonio. I'll be a force in it, and we'll do this on our terms." Antonio nodded, the weight of her words settling into his chest. She was right. They didn't have to choose between love and power. They could have both, as long as they built it together. As they stood up, hand in hand, Antonio felt the first real sense of hope he had felt in years. He had always been a man who had ruled with force, with fear, but Mitchell had shown him a different way, a way where love and power didn't have to be opposites. They could be allies. "Together," he whispered as they walked toward the door. Mitchell's smile was all the answer he needed. They were stepping into a future of their own making, a future that combined love, power, and trust. And for the first time, Antonio knew he was ready to face it.